Hello everyone, today we talk about Landsknechte warfare, a very famous video of mine that probably many of you subscribed from to the channel, was dedicated to sort of an introductory history of the Landsknechte. That is unavoidably a military history, but we were talking about it in general. Today I would like to focus a little bit more on some sort of campaign, battle, kind of more evidential military history profile. It will integrate with the previous one. In any case, we will make other videos about the Landsknechte, specific battles where they fought. Also, we're going to reconstruct from primary sources. As always, I'm trying to expand a little bit more in the last months, as you've probably realized, on 16th century warfare, because we actually always had sort of substantial amount of it, but not necessarily from an evidential point of view. I plan to make early modern battle videos pretty soon. Thanks to the aforementioned video, we don't have to really introduce the Landsknechte, that were this German mercenary infantry, if we were to describe them in very approximate fashion, because the thing was a bit more complicated, and however rose to prominence in the late 15th and early 16th centuries within the Holy Roman Empire, at the time a loose confederation of hundreds of semi-independent territories, principalities, bishoprics, and free cities, nominally headed by an elected emperor from the Habsburg dynasty. We will also continue our series about early modern Habsburg history. I made lots of videos explaining essentially what the Habsburgs were doing at this point in 16th century Germany and Europe in general, what was their universal role fundamentally, but also their deep limitations. In fact, during this era, the empire faced constant threats from powerful neighbors, including the expanding Ottoman Empire to the southeast, the Valois kings of France to the west, and internal rebellions fueled by religious tensions and social unrest. I also made a mini-series about the German peasant revolt, the largest insurrection in Europe before the French Revolution. So you can get more or less what we're looking at. Made different videos about the Italian wars. We looked at also specific sort of military topics like early modern Catholic German artillery, dedicating wide space to Maximilian I's artillery. That was increased at this point to confer, in fact, to the imperial forces that now were constituted by Maximilian's creation of the Landsknechten, a sort of competitive edge in open field. I just recently made a video about the actual importance of artillery, late Middle Ages and the early modern age. We have definitely lots of topics, as always, on that. Now, what was the problem here? Is that traditional feudal levies, that is to say, short-term knights and largely peasant militias, they were also the burghers of the German communes. Machiavelli describes quite interestingly, probably overrates to a degree, their administration. Well, altogether, these were properly medieval armies. They proved inadequate against disciplined professional forces like the Swiss Reichsläufer, who pioneered the use of dense spike squares to dominate late medieval battlefields. Again, just recently made that video about both Swiss warfare and early artillery impact between the 15th and beginning of the 16th century that can well tie up with this. The term Reichsläufer has to do with essentially like almost an adventurer, somebody that is always marching somewhere. And the Germans were not immune to such ventures, because during the Middle Ages also their knights historically had been quite prominent in mercenarism, in the Crusades and so on. It was this idea that Germany, again, a bit throughout like the, if not Malthusian, probably also migration era almost patterns, Central Europe routinely sort of sends out manpower, right? Because actually locally there isn't such a high per capita wealth sustainability. There are still also pretty pretty warlike. At least Germany doesn't really quite have, especially an eastern frontier. It's a feudal mess that is habituated to be constantly at war, with especially probably a societal outcome in terms of proper emarginated that are pretty good file and rank troops. Made lots of videos. This is a very famous topic in general, in especially modern historiography, that mostly had to do with the fringe of Europe. But Germany was, in terms of the broader Western civilization, sort of a hybrid between a more traditional and more and a modernizing world, so to say, and especially at this point, because especially in the first half of the 16th century, as we will see here, so the Landsknechte were quite competitive. They would provide still with pretty substantial force that allows the Habsburgs to play the game. Not as well as the French or the Spanish, but still, all right? And even having this beef with the Swiss that historically had also defied Habsburgic power to begin with, but that became the model for the same, for any pike formation out there, including the Landsknechte that were, as the typical, again, final rank soldier of the era, infantrymen in this dense pike squares that will rise to dominate, again, a Renaissance warfare. Mostly, however, in a combined armed tactics with a shot, which especially the Swiss didn't quite fully level. Now, the Landsknechte emerged exactly as a Habsburg response to the Swiss, but mostly to the general development effect of Western European armies. All right, for different reasons, the Habsburgs had managed to successfully reunite, politically speaking. They found themselves, in a way, regardless of threats that we think about the Ottomans, the siege of Vienna 1529, yes, those existed, but as we've seen in the videos about their sort of the outland, the general sort of domain that they had established, they were fundamentally isolated from major powers in terms of direct contiguity, especially ever since Hungary had collapsed. So yes, paradoxically, now they had a frontier with the Ottomans, but a very stretched one for the Turks themselves, which is something we've seen also in the videos about the 1683 campaign. And I have to continue, by the way, our introduction to the Turkish wars, making a bit more on them to begin with. The Landsknechte thus provided the emperors with a reliable, large-scale source of trained foot soldiers that could be recruited from German-speaking regions and deployed across diverse theaters from Italy to the Ottoman frontier. In many ways, they were very similar. Also, given their largely southern German, also partly Rhenish origin, they came a bit from everywhere, but mostly, right, are similar to the same Swiss. Even though they were deeply different in organization, in ethos, and so on, they were already the product of two very different social, cultural, anthropological systems, all right, and with ferociously opposite allegiances. What is paradoxical of the Swiss is that they had been born against fighting the Habsburgs as essentially the most anti-aristocratic force out there, successfully defying, in fact, the same Holy Roman Emperor, and ending up to serve the single most monarchic power in Europe ever, that is the French, that obviously were also the opponents of the Habsburgs during the Italian wars, where the Landsknechte also sort of had a major tactical presence, especially from the imperial side. Now, the Landsknechte arose in the late 1480s as a deliberate Habsburg attempt to copy and institutionalize the pike square tactics that had just shattered the last major feudal army in Western Europe, namely the Burgundian ordinances of Charles the Bold. As we've seen in the last video about the Swiss, probably the sort of Swiss, the spread of the Swiss model has been slightly overrated, not just because the Swiss basically sort of rose to prominence for a couple of generations, but fundamentally they were never, let's say, at least a successful regional power in terms of expansionistic capacity. At some point, they occupied Milan. They managed to, in the mess of the Italian wars, to do something really potentially conducive to a further expansion, but were essentially beaten back into their highlands by the major powers out there. I mean, they couldn't compete with the Spanish to an extent, not even with the Germans. And in any case, also their participation to the French cause was very much separated from a general sort of political alignment with France, right? But there is no doubt that their insight, and if anything, we haven't quite talked just about this specific idea, that is, hadn't the Swiss been there? Like, what kind of, hadn't the Swiss been beaten, for example, at Arbedo, and hadn't from there on specifically wanted to organize their forces in the way that became mostly famous for, right? Who would have actually gone? It's obvious that Renaissance warfare would have developed anyway on the basis of pike squares, right? And we often give, and if you look especially at Western warfare, especially in the last centuries of the Middle Ages, you realize that the Westerners fought pretty much in the same way, right? There were hardly at this point any sort of local ethnic fashion, especially in the West, or at least even in Central Europe, at large, aside from some steppe relic. We're not talking about this for the Swiss, even though we should appreciate the primitive character, almost the migration era mindset of the Fulkon, of the old this Alemannic people that successfully had this major tactical, if anything, exploit out there. What matters is, however, that this model spreads, right? And the Swiss Reichsläufe in particular had proven their model devastatingly effective across the Burgundian Wars. This was a series, we'll talk about them better at some point, wars in the 1470s, where Duke Charles the Bold of Burgundy sought to create a powerful middle kingdom between France and the Empire, but was soundly defeated, decisively, mortally defeated by the Swiss Confederates, as a matter of fact. I have my own opinion also about the alleged solidity of Burgundy that has been overrated, in my opinion, for different reasons, but there is no doubt that they had essentially the most advanced military in Europe at that point. You can argue France had basically the same, or at least they were developing in parallel, so shouldn't be too categorical. But again, Charles the Bold's ordinances and the Venetian condotta, as we've seen also in the video about Corleone, essentially were the most advanced armies out there. And the Swiss, out of ability, luck, because no great army wins without luck to begin with. This is a theological principle that you can appreciate since the times of the Fortuna Kaisers and the entire sort of Indo-European Trinity concept, but also circumstantial situations. Yes, the Swiss victories over the Burgundians are serious, so they weren't random, but it's a bit like there are other instances in Europe. Think about the Hussites, very different story there as well, but were they, for example, in a broader sense, a competitive model? Well, the Italian wars will actually show that alone, not quite, because the Swiss also largely fight as a tactical element of the broader French army. Not only, but also. Now, before this, at Grandson, on March the 2nd, 1476, the Swiss three-column advance caught Charles the Bold's artillery still limbered and his knights unable to maneuver on the narrow plateau. The Burgundians broke after losing most of their guns and several thousand men. This is important because, as we were saying before, the Swiss, by the way, they weren't only Swiss, and also other soldiers that had fought in those wars, including from the other side, right? In the Burgundian army, of the Germans, of the Italians, the Spanish, the French, the English, surely learned something out of this. Surely there were some Landsknechte that had fought in the Burgundian army at the beginning and also still hated the Swiss for some reason. At Morat, on June the 22nd, 1476, the Swiss used the lake shore and marched to channel the Burgundian assault into a killing ground. The counterattack with such coordinated violence occurred that Charles barely escaped and left behind an estimated 12,000 dead, which is a bit too much, but it still speaks of the effectiveness of the Swiss, especially in this terrain. The Swiss had always been very good at exploiting terrain for different reasons, already from the times of sort of more conventional communal infantry. But, as you know, the decisive stroke fell at Nancy on January the 5th, 1477, In driving snow, the Swiss smashed the Burgundian center, overran the Duke's position, and killed Charles himself. His stripped and frozen body was later pulled from a pond by peasants who recognized him only by a distinctive scar. Now, these three engagements convinced Archduke Maximilian, who had gained the Burgundian Netherlands through marriage to Mary of Burgundy on August 19, 1477, the daughter of Charles. And that mounted feudal hosts and short-service mercenaries that could no longer compete against disciplined deep-order infantry armed predominantly with long pikes and willing to close to contact at a steady, unflinching pace. That's how the Swiss had achieved this, and if you wonder why, this was not like some sort of strange alchemical formula, or somebody woke up in the morning and said, okay, let's do that. This corresponds to broader political expansions of coercive capacity of the Swiss Confederacy, its further, in fact, compaction and solidity in terms of external directions. The Burgundians had sort of pretty much gone at war with the Swiss that had thus reacted. Their point, though, was that there were tactical reasons. We mentioned Arbedo before, where Carmagnola's dismounted men-at-arms had beaten the Swiss, still at that point armed largely with halberds, that require, in a sense, even in terms of individual hand-to-hand combat, a more sophisticated fencing, but in that sense, in a broader formation, are not that effective even against dismounted knights that simply struck them with the longer lances, even though it was also a matter of course, of moral forces, Clausewitzingly speaking. So the Swiss decided to, if anything, invest a larger amount of wealth, right, of their own resources to train, to spend probably time and energy to work to train larger bodies of infantrymen. In a sense, that's also what they had. Switzerland was pretty big at this point, right? It was a substantial mass that could really provide with lots of the aforementioned type of essentially forestater. Already the richest cities were basically managing this also from a financial standpoint, and finally allowing infantry, after centuries of, if anything, subordination to cavalry, even the victories of infantry in the early 14th century that had also left space with the crisis of the following decades to a further refeudalization of warfare, right? There wasn't a linear increase in infantry capacity in that sense. Had not much to do with any kind of sort of infantry superiority, if not in very relative terms, right? And that entailed most of the infantry. They could advance and they could attack as well, but mostly, especially against cavalry in open field, they would pick like a very sort of good ground to defend, to stand still, very thickly compact, because that was the only way you could hope to withstand a cavalry charge. There were pikemen in the front, as always, because that's only the only actual weapon that can beat cavalry, but the guys behind didn't, also because they had to be largely stationary. They didn't have so much training, especially militia. Now, instead, the Swiss had extended the pike to the wall formation, almost the wall formation, which required a much greater collective training, because it's very difficult to keep all the pikemen perfectly aligned, maintaining the same pace, the rolling of the drum and so on. It takes maneuvering, lots of exercises in that sense, and it's still, you can't say the good enough that the Swiss had, because this was definitely their best, but in a sense was also probably not such a revolutionary concept. It was truly new in medieval warfare. You didn't see such formations since antiquity. The need to have pikemen in particular is more, in the sense, a contingental Swiss need than, oh my God, like they were restoring, I don't know, the Macedonian phalanx. They worked in very different ways for very different purposes. They weren't even particularly big formations at the end of the day. They were big for the individual unit and the tactics they performed, but at large, the armies were pretty small. Nevertheless, they had that significant success. Maximilian, by the way, found himself in this very interesting situation of as medieval rulers mostly were at that point, if not having enough resources, but having suddenly acquired a much wider amount of territories from the death of his father-in-law, that could, in a way, and for example, Flanders, that had historically served with large bodies of infantry, but sort of militia that had been repeatedly beaten by the Burgundian knights on a regular basis. It was mostly the norm up to that point. I also made a video about that. We'll continue doing so. Maximilian had now also a very important vest in Europe as Holy Roman Emperor, as having revived, as we were saying before, Habsburgic power at a truly regional scale. So there was a whole set of coincidences of aligning factors that allowed him, with his very strong, robust energy and will, to start this reform. Maximilian began to recruit German-speaking companies that could be retained longer, paid, at least in theory, more consistently. The pay, as you know, will be the big problem of the entire history, but also mostly modern warfare, but also for the Landsknecht and continuously threatening to mutiny and so on, and drilled to replicate the Swiss combination of pike wall, halberdier exploitation teams to a degree, and aggressive forward movement. At this point, infantry began for the first time again to advance against cavalry. Not always, right? They could also simply stand their ground, and cavalry would have a lot of problem breaking through like such a compact mass of pikemen in defense. If they were dangerous in attack, as we've seen, the Swiss had basically mostly caught the enemy off guard out of sheer sort of out-maneuvering rather than any deeply qualitative capacity of a mono-arm system, by the way, that during the Italian wars, in fact, dreadfully proved to be incredibly dangerous in more open grounds and against combined armed forces of the largest powers out there. Now, the same Swiss were dependent on French gendarmes and their artillery. Switzerland didn't practically have any real resource out there. The Swiss didn't have any major arms and armor production. They had to take their guns mostly as a prey of war from the Burgundian spoils. Now, the word Landsknecht itself surfaces in scattered documents of the 1470s, sometimes denoting armed bailiffs or court retainers in southern Germany, because these were properly. It's like when you say civic servant. Knecht derives exactly from actually the same etymology of knight that came to be something else, but it originally was truly indicating in Germanic languages this properly servants, so those retinue men essentially that follow the actual higher lords. All right, and of course, Land stands for the country, the broader Germany is the empire, basically. So these were properly the servants of the empire. Sometimes certain so it started as with these officials, mostly called like that. It was a term already present probably to a degree, and sometimes at this point you start seeing certain foot in Charles the Bold's final campaigns even as Landsknechte. So even in the Burgundian army, that it was very multinational. Again, basically all European nationalities fought in Western European nationalities, at least in Charles the Bold's army. But the term Landsknecht acquired its specific military connotation only after 1486, 1487. In fact, when Maximilian started forming distinct units on a larger scale that would become mostly famous as the Landsknechte. One of the first identifiable bodies was the guard given in 1487 to Eitel Friedrich II, the Count of Hohenzollern, a prominent Swabian noble and military commander who served as one of Maximilian's trusted captains in the early organization of these forces, and trained in Bruges by Swiss instructors who had either defected after the Burgundian collapse or been hired as technical experts. And this is very interesting because, as we'll see now, Maximilian will even try to carry out, at least maybe we'll not talk about it, but the Battle of Guinegate was the first sort of kind of half victory that the Flemish managed to, under the Habsburgs, to inflict on the French during the re-expansion of the French market toward the northeast. There was a broader attempt by Maximilian to train an effective body, some sort of land regiment of Flemish pikemen trained by the same Swiss instructors, well, after the same Swiss model, but a broader reform failed. As you know, basically the Netherlands will not have really a substantial army up to the time of the 80 Years' War, right? And forming even at that time, definitely not quite in a competitive way, especially against the Spanish that had mostly inherited the best tradition of the Swiss, paradoxically, as they were also inheriting the Burgundian legacy. In many ways, the Tercios also are a topic we have to come back on, even though we have already studied it in some instances. By February 1488, the newly chartered Swabian League agreed at Esslingen on February 14th specifically as a defensive alliance of Swabian cities, knights and prelates formed to protect regional autonomy against external threats like Bavarian expansion, mustered what is conventionally treated as the first proper Landsknecht army raised inside the empire. 12,000 foot supported by 1,200 horse, raised to block Wittelsbach ambitions in Bavaria and Bohemian pressure from the east. This is a pretty substantial army, right? It has a very interesting cavalry-infantry ratio of 1:10, which it means that infantry is important. Normally, medieval armies tended to have some sort of higher cavalry capacity. This is true. We've seen it also, for example, in some of the feudal armies that put down on their own, in some local context, the German peasant uprisings a couple of generations later. This is becoming something serious. You see, there is cavalry already. It's only the Swiss that really went at war without practically anything else. Like also the missile component in the Swiss army was present, but minimal. It was not a fully fledged arm. On the contrary, as we've seen, Maximilian is also developing consistent artillery. I mean, he's the only Roman emperor. He can definitely afford a large army. 12,000, 13,200. It's not immense, but it's still like a significant provincial to regional force. The League's muster procedures, pay scales, and rudimentary articles of war already outlined the regimental framework that would later solidify. Right? Those early troops showed instant battlefield value in the Austrian-Hungarian War of 1490. Maximilian employed them to recover Vienna and expel Matthias Corvinus's Hungarian garrisons from Lower and Inner Austria, because quite interesting things had historically happened with also the Black Army, and if anything, we'll come back on that as well. You understand here, even chronologically and territorially, how things are overlapping. We see that essentially the Matthias Corvinus's campaigns had briefly and aggressively occupied Vienna, much of Austria in the 1480s as part of his efforts to expand Hungarian influence westward. Yet, the campaign also exposed the chronic vulnerability to pay disputes as well. After the troops sacked Stuhl-Weissenburg, that is, Székesfehérvár, they refused to march further towards Buda, citing months of arrears. Typical. All right. Also made videos about medieval German-Hungarian warfare since the time of the 11th century. And you realize how these places were almost always kind of the same theaters, and it's fascinating to see how the Germans obviously were essentially the stronger element, not always, but advancing towards the Hungarian heartland. At some point, things becoming a bit too difficult because of guerrilla, hit and run, skirmishes, harassment, tough ground in some cases. And this mutiny, because of course the money was not there really, forced Maximilian to abandon the offensive and fall back on diplomacy. Here we don't sort of look at the stretches, the strings of political and strategical issues, but you understand the effort, like the sort of extreme boundaries that these forces were meant to push. Like as imperial forces, really Maximilian tested them in this fashion. The episode reinforced, however, the emperor's determination to create a more cohesive, predominantly Germanic force governed by stricter articles and, if possible, more dependable funding. From the early 1490s, recruitment therefore focused heavily on men from Swabia, Franconia, the Upper Rhine, Austria proper, Alsace, Tyrol, and the other Elbländer, the hereditary lands of the Habsburgs, deliberately reducing reliance on non-German elements that might dilute loyalty or corporate identity. It's a very interesting dynamic in early sort of modern nationhood, where essentially Germany understands, as you know, since probably also the crisis of the same universal authority as the Holy Roman Empire, the German nation, there is a sense, broadly speaking, that all these sort of loosely controlled land atavically corresponding to some sort of sub-ethnic divisions of these Germanic populations of Central Europe were now truly configured as essentially a German nation, right? And people sort of debate this very much today. There are sort of even recent videos on YouTube that discuss this. I'm not going to digress on it. It would be very interesting to explain better how. But you see, the main, sort of the easiest way to explain this is the two concepts coexisting, overlapping, right? There's no doubt that Germany was a federal, but in this sense also very intricate feudal mess, very varied, very uneven, right? But still resourceful, especially at this point in history. The Germans were as technologically advanced as the Italians. There was a certain dynamism, a certain, at this point in particular, this later expansion. Many countries like England, Germany, that had historically been secondary to the more developed like France or Italy, normally have this later tail strikes. If you look at the various sort of ups and downs of civilization, if you look at the German Peasant War, it's basically what had happened in the 14th century in France with the Jacquerie, right? They also arrived later, and in fact, Germany didn't go that far further. By the mid-16th century, there is a striking crisis again. Essentially, it's not until like sort of timidly the end of the 30 Years' War, especially starting from the mid-18th century, Germany truly mounts up like some truly imperial regional power competitive with the greater ones in the West. Now, the smaller detachments in the 1490s repeatedly outperformed regional opponents who lacked equivalent training, armament, or discipline. Landsknechte were better trained, they were a quality force. They cost, right? But they were effective. In the Frisian Wars, for example, they overcame much larger peasant militias, which was admittedly a fairly easy thing to do, hadn't it been for the fact that the Frisians fought on incredibly tough terrain. I made a video about the Dithmarsche and their labyrinthic defensive system across all those, in fact, marshes. These are essentially Frisians, but living in the Jutland Peninsula and the west coast, and they had historically defied, especially the feudal forces of the Counts of Holstein, up to still these times technically. But we're talking Frisia proper in these wars with Landsknechte, and their tight-piped formations and supporting halberdiers were definitely more cohesive, more courageous than peasant levies. In July, there were also, for that matter, knights, etc. So we're not talking as if Frisia was nothing. There were burghers, there were guns, and so on, but never to the scale that the bigger German civilization, the one coming from essentially the south, from Austria in this case, could provide. In July 1502, a modest force of 1,800 Germans serving the Danish crown at the siege of Älvsborg fortress in Sweden confronted an estimated 15,000 Swedish farmers and levies. Paul Dolnstein's contemporary letter records that the Germans cut down most of the attackers in close combat and scattered the survivors, suffering only light casualties themselves. Sometimes Landsknechte were lent to other powers, sometimes a bit like the Swiss that originally were to basically just serve at the command of local authorities, but would sell their services autonomously to other countries. especially in Northern Europe, the Germans had historically constituted the best mercenaries out there, especially in terms of brutal sort of, I don't know, infantry, cavalry. Like, there were other nationalities that provided sort of more technical sophistication, etc. But again, even in demographic terms, they were available, right? And countries like England, for example, tended to import everything from the continent in terms of guns, armor, including also mercenaries, infantrymen. We've seen them during different videos, in the videos about the Tudor army organization, for that matter. One chapter is dedicated to infantry in particular. Now, these actions steadily established a reputation for tactical reliability when officers were competent and arrears were kept within tolerable limits, at least, even though pay disputes remained the single greatest structural weakness of the entire institution. The first large-scale collision with the Swiss Reisläufer came, however, during the War of the League of Cambrai, 1508-1516. This was, as you know, a complex clash where major European powers, including France, the Empire, the Papacy, and Venice, fought over control of northern Italy. At Novara on June the 6th, 1513, a French army that included several thousand Landsknechte in its pay was surprised at first light by 12,000 Swiss who had force-marched overnight from Milan. The Swiss achieved complete encirclement, overran the artillery, shattered the German squares after prolonged hand-to-hand fighting, and executed several hundred captured Landsknechte on the field as a pointed warning against Germans serving France. This is important because the Swiss here were fighting with the Milanese against the French that had German mercenaries that, as we've seen, were fairly common throughout the late Middle Ages, the early modern age, from really a long time. Like, you find German mercenaries in French employ during the battles of the 100 Years' War. You find them later, as we've seen in the video, for example, about the Battle of Dreux at the time of the French Wars of Religion. This was a massive showdown, also involving, as you understand here, significant manpower, very sort of contested clash, a bloodbath, where the Swiss proved their initial superiority over the Landsknecht. They really hated each other, by the way. And the mutual antipathy between the two corps thus became visceral and enduring. Yet, the Imperial Landsknechte quickly reversed the ledger. At Bicocca on April the 27th, 1522, Prospero Colonna's combined Imperial Papal Spanish force, anchored by Frundsberg's Germans behind a sunken road and earth rampart just north of Milan, repulsed a direct Swiss frontal assault with successive ranks of arquebus fire followed by pike countercharges. Swiss losses exceeded 3,000, including 20 captains and Arnold Winkelried of Unterwalden, while Imperial casualties stayed remarkably low. This is very important because you see how the Landsknechte have started upgrading towards a more combined armed tactic that the Spanish were in particular pioneering. So Frundsberg had, that we have encountered also in the video about Giovanni de' Medici, was a hell of a fighter. Like, later on at Pavia would hold his ground. We'll see them now because we're talking in Landsknechte anyway. So really tough commanders that began properly to experiment the pike and shot arms combination that we've seen also being born literally at this point in history by the military genius of Gonzalo de Cordoba, the Gran Capitan, at the Battle of Cerignola. So this Landsknecht, Spanish, in part, so this Italian allies and technically imperial subjects, would sort of gradually uniform a bit as all the rest of Europe along the what will later become probably the Tercio model that, however, was basically born in tactical principle at this point. Now, 3 years after Bicocca, at Marignano in particular, on September from the 13th to the 14th, 1515, the Black Band, a notably large Landsknecht contingent in French service that reached up to 17,000 men, including 2,000 specialized two-hander troops originally raised by George, the Duke of Saxony, in 1514 for his feud in East Frisia, always the same old story, before entering French pay under Charles II, the Duke of Guelders, and Francis I. Held the ditch and artillery line with great determination, but eventually recoiled under repeated heavy cavalry charges, led personally by Francis I and supported by Venetian reinforcements, arriving under Bartolomeo d'Alviano on the second day. The two-day action, though tactically inconclusive, proved one of the last occasions on which Swiss impetus alone could overpower well-supported German formations. As we've seen, telling the truth, cavalry was quite important, and the myth that you somehow, or sometimes at least, hear that nobody can charge into pikes, that it just takes to use that weapon. Medieval cavalry had always been charging into pikes. That's what they did for a living, right? Otherwise, they could have never been able to frontally break infantry, as they did largely throughout most of the overwhelming majority of the Middle Ages. Now, under Charles V of Habsburg, the regiments attained their maximum size and battlefield reputation. In the Italian War of 1521-26, that was the high point of the Italian wars, the Landsknechte constituted the majorly infantry element in every significant imperial operation in Lombardy. At the most famous Battle of Pavia on February 24th, 1525, Georg von Fronsberg, the renowned German knight and organizer, often called the, quote, father of the Landsknechte, for his role in shaping their tactics and leadership, led the main German blocks, 12,000 Landsknechte in total, while Fernando d'Avalos commanded the Spanish arquebusiers and Charles de Lannoy directed the imperial cavalry. After a carefully executed night march, the Imperials breached the park wall at Porta Pescarina near San Genesio, infiltrated under darkness, and by dawn had taken position inside the French camp in the Visconti Park of Mirabello. The French gendarmerie charged Lannoy's outnumbered horse and dispersed them, but the maneuver pulled Francis I away from his principal infantry under Richard de la Pole and François de Lorraine. Spanish and German arquebusiers and pikemen then converged from several directions, trapping the French heavy cavalry among the trees and methodically slaughtering them. The Black Band, nominally directed by de Lorraine and de la Pole, the latter was famous. It was a Yorkist claimant to the English throne who had long served French interests as a military adventurer. Because, if you look at the timeline, of course, it was a bit late for Yorkist claims. Advanced to relieve the king, but was enveloped by Frundsberg's regiments and virtually annihilated on the spot after its Obrist, that is the colonel, essentially, Georg Langenmantel, fell attempting to challenge the imperial commanders to single combat. It was still that age, right? Francis, and before telling you again how important cavalry really was, continued fighting until his horse was killed. Some accounts credit Cesare Ercolani and others, some Landsknechte, telling you the truth. But again, there were also different nationalities sometimes here and there, and was captured. The action decimated the French high nobility. Bonnivet, La Tremoille, La Palisse, René of Savoie, and many others died, whereas imperial losses remained comparatively modest. This is naturally a very famous battle. It shows you how essentially what was fought within the park of the Villa Mirabello was essentially yet another closed ground, basically, where cavalry could scarcely operate. They didn't even know essentially what they were going against at some point. Everything was marvelously coordinated in outcome, but as it was happening, it was actually a mess, and it was an incredibly messy clash itself. Yet, combined armed tactics, pike and shot in particular, managed to successfully crush the flower of the French nobility and to capture even the same French king. Right, so this is big, and Pavia is a bit with Frundsberg, of course, in many ways, the accomplishment of the Landsknechte, also the Spanish troops who were there. But the high point, definitely not just of the Italian border, but also of, you can argue, the same Landsknecht, say, military achievement, let's say. 4 years later, the same infantry demonstrated its value in an entirely different theater. During the first Ottoman siege of Vienna from September the 27th to October the 15th, 1529, Nicholas Count of Salm, a veteran imperial commander in his 70s by then, who had previously distinguished himself capturing the same Francis I at Pavia under his control, organized the defense of the city with roughly 21,000 men against Suleiman the Magnificent's enormous host. I made a video about the campaign. It's very sort of tiny, so not even an introduction to the campaign, but discussing it anyway. Contemporary estimates vary between contemporary estimates of the time, right? Too much, like in the hundreds of thousands. I made an entire video, like a pretty in-depth one, about the actual size of Ottoman hosts at that point, and they were pretty big, but also within kind of the logistical norm, still essentially several tens of thousands as the expedition, but the fighting force was more modest. In any case, this was enormous for the times, and because the problem was not putting lots of troops together, but was to adequately supply them and to pay them, which is the problem that the more fragmented West to an extent had, at least especially the empire, against the Ottomans, but not because quality or actually even absolute capacity of these countries really lacked, right? The Ottomans had a more unified command. They had come from out of a different sort of history. We're not here to discuss that. You can find that video about the Ottoman army strength during the early modern era in the top fixed comment down below. And the effective combat strength after the arduous rain-drenched march through Bulgaria was substantially lower, even the more optimistic estimates, of course. Salm strengthened the 300-year-old city walls with earthen ramparts and bastions, blocked the four gates, cleared fields of fire by demolishing buildings, and set his headquarters near St. Stephen's Cathedral. German Landsknecht pikemen and Spanish arquebusiers formed the core of the infantry. Serbian hussars under Pavle Bakic supplied mobile cavalry support. Ottoman sappers drove mines under the walls, but repeated sorties, frequently led by the Serbian horsemen, that were good at that hit-and-run tactic, were similar to what the Ottomans used themselves, because there were Serbians also from the other side for that matter, disrupted the galleries and detonated several charges prematurely. On October the 6th, 8,000 defenders sallied against the mining parties, destroying many tunnels by taking heavy losses in the confined underground fighting. On October the 14th, the final large-scale assault, even with extra pay promised to the Janissaries, collapsed under concentrated arquebus and pike fire. You want to appreciate this aspect, that while the Janissaries were definitely the stormtroopers of the situation, they carried out assaults along the same tactical pattern what you see during World War I, like massive battles. First of all, mining, sort of blowing up the enemy fortifications, bombarding, and then attacking. But the Westerners had the edge, in this case, even inferiority in defense, through a more courageous heavy infantry that the Ottomans didn't have. The Ottomans were pretty much good at everything, also at sort of the shot, but the shot, even in the age of firearms, is still a secondary arm, especially in this period, also for the Westerners. And so at large, a very solid, courageous bulk of heavy infantry is not quite there, even though the Janissaries were at some point also well equipped, armored, etc. They were normally lighter. Very, very bold, very aggressive, very adaptable, very malleable, but also for that reason, relatively lighter. And in these roles, that wasn't properly in a socio-economical sense in the Ottoman Empire, what you see again in the European Third Estate, the burghers of the German community. Like there wasn't such a thing. In this case, Vienna was, of course, defending itself primarily through militia, but the Landsknechte, as the crack force naturally the emperor had sent to defend its... Vienna is not quite entirely a capital as we understand it in a modernistic sense, but de facto, like, definitely the most important city. Suleiman abandoned the siege on the following day, so for different other reasons that needed, however, to be fought in the breaches of Vienna's walls, retreating through deepening mud and early snow with severe losses in men, transport, animals, and artillery left behind. Nature helped a bit the Christians there because that was apparently particularly humid rather than just cold autumn approaching. Now, the repulse confirmed the practical limit of Ottoman field army penetration into Central Europe at that moment and preserved Habsburg control of Austria for another generation. The very troops who had helped save Vienna had only 2 years before carried out one of the most infamous episodes of the Italian wars as well. We all know what we're talking about. After the imperial success against the French in Lombardy in late 1526 and early 1527, the army, approximately 14,000 Landsknechte under Frundsberg, 6,000 Spaniards under Charles III, Duke of Bourbon. This was, as you know, the very powerful French nobleman that, the fact, had essentially a state within the state in the very heart of France, and he passed to the side of the Habsburgs, together with Italian foot and cavalry, went unpaid despite months of victories. Mutiny compelled Bourbon and Frundsberg to lead the 34,000-strong force southward toward Rome, which was weakly garrisoned and diplomatically exposed after Clement VII joined the Anti-Imperial League of Cognac. This was famously like the alliance formed in 1526 by France, the papacy, Venice, Florence, and others to curb Habsburg dominance in Italy. The papacy essentially flipped the lines, like after Pavia, the empire was too strong, and so there was this redrawing of alliances. I also made a video about, as we were saying before, Giovanni delle Bandinere, that was essentially the only papal commander able to operate initially against the approaching incoming army in northern Italy, and he was fatally wounded by a falconet shot while attempting to bar the pass to the Landsknechte. And as we've seen also, the Spanish, even the Italian forces, what is paradoxical is that the Landsknechte here were the imperial soldier, but they were also, as sort of normally foretestators, lesser people, like mostly Protestants. And this is interesting because even like today, I mean, how many sort of people in different countries' armed forces have sort of different political and other kind of beliefs compared to the ones with which they're fighting. This is completely normal, but it would be paradoxically the most Catholic Spaniards that would become the most ferocious sackers of Rome. That, as you know, suffered one of the most devastating loots, and on top of that, the plague broke out. The Ottomans were even passing by the Mediterranean coastline. They had the Genoese on their heels, as we've seen also in the relative video, but had they really wanted to land and seize Rome, they could have done it in that moment, but with no sort of temporary, like it was just like to show off, but they wouldn't even do it, in part also because of the plague out there. We have seen in the video about Giovanni delle Bandinere, by the way, that those Italian condottieri were turning to something very similar to what essentially even the Germans will develop later with the Reiter, so mounted arquebusiers, because at that point it was better just to harass the logistical line of this massive army and try to break it apart than attacking them frontally. They didn't have manpower in the Papal States to block it. In fact, after the death of Medici, there was also the father of the future Cosimo I, the Duke, within the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, and son of Caterina Sforza, as a matter of fact, that had also fought against the French herself. So it's a very interesting arc there. Medici was an incredibly brutal person for that, but also a really good commander. Now, on May the 6th, 1527, the walls of Rome were breached near the Gianicolo and Vatican Hills. Bourbon died early in the assault. Cellini later claimed personal credit for the shot. This is a very funny incident, by the way, because apparently he was delecting himself with a falconet from the top of Castel Sant'Angelo. Cellini was a polymath of the era, mostly a goldsmith, but also some sort of engineer. And he claims a bit, in the story is a bit exaggerated, that in any case, he was the guy to shoot Bourbon, who was literally cut in half by a falconet shot. And definitely those kind of wounds could happen. He did die anyway, leaving command to Philibert of Chalon, Prince of Orange, who lacked the moral authority, however, to control the troops. This was a full-scale sack. The Swiss Guard, famously enough, 189 strong, made their final stand in the Teutonic Cemetery inside the Vatican. If you ever visit Rome, please go there, because it's one of the most beautiful. Like, you feel the massacre there. It's something insane that the Swiss, it's one of the single most heroic pages in military history. They were cut to pieces to the very last, buying just enough time for Clement to reach Castel Sant'Angelo via the Passetto corridor. That is this closed passage, and eventually also fled Rome. There are also some Landsknechte graffiti for that matter in some churches of Rome where they were bivouacking after the sack, in which they were literally saying, the Pope fled, all this kind of stuff. Only 42 guardsmen actually survived. But the sack lasted 8 months. Churches, monasteries, palaces of cardinals and prelates, even residences of pro-imperial families were systematically plundered. This was a terrible moment when Charles V, because technically these were his army, received the news of the sack. He ordered basically everybody to wear black at the court of Spain, where it was Philip, but the future Philip II had just been born. So actually, it was a festive moment. He wanted everybody to wear somber because of this total disaster that stained imperial reputation. Relics were desecrated, sacred images smashed, nuns raped, monks castrated, clergy hunted down with particular savagery by Lutheran Landsknechte, who regarded the city as the seat of Antichrist. Prisoners of every rank were taken for ransom. Prominent citizens paid ruinous sums to preserve life and property. The only paradoxically, there were some Roman commanders or other Italian commanders that were very rich, affluent people. They had palaces in Rome, and though that helped lots of people to escape, they stuffed them in. And since they were the palaces of some commanders, the soldiers showed essentially respect toward they didn't attack those houses. But it was really, again, a terrible moment. The population fell from roughly 55,000 to 10,000 allegedly. At least in the moment, Rome was repopulated quite quickly, like the Roman Renaissance would go on further, etc. But if we're talking murder, flight, starvation, the plague that followed, really for a while, Rome had this drastic drop in population. Now, the outrage widened the Catholic-Protestant rift in all of this and forced Clement VII into a markedly more compliant posture towards Charles V, paradoxically, in the years that followed. Landsknechte were just as routinely deployed against internal revolts, by the way. In the German Peasants' War of 1524-25, as we've seen, they formed the crushing, like the core infantry in the armies that suppressed the risings across Swabia, Franconia, Thuringia, and Alsace. We're talking massive slaughters. As we've seen in those videos, the peasant armies were practically a joke. Like, they were industrious their own way, etc., but they lacked any sort of coherent strategy, technical means, including the professional soldiery, right? So this turned into a massacre of biblical proportions. Also, when the Habsburgs became probably a global power with the inheritance, especially of Philip the Fair, of Charles V, of the Spanish thrones, plural, the Landsknechte went over to the Iberian Peninsula. In 1526, they helped royal Valencian authorities crush the first revolt of Espada in the Espadan mountains of modern Castilla province, where thousands of Morisco fellahin rose against the forced conversion edict promulgated that year. These uprisings are quite interesting because, again, it was full of mudéjars at that point that refused to go down. There were large swathes of Spain that had pretty big Islamic Jewish minorities. Smaller detachments held Habsburg Ottoman border garrisons in Austria and Hungary as well throughout the 1530s. We have seen this well also in the Krajina. It was mostly, settled by colonists coming from the south, mostly refugees from, the Hajduk of Serbia, etc. Also, the Landsknechte took part in local skirmishes and relief expeditions of all sorts. We've seen them also made some videos about Tunis, about Algiers. The basic fighting unit of the Landsknechte remained the regiment of roughly 4,000 men led by an obrist who held a Bestallungsbrief that fixed establishment, pay rates, and disciplinary articles. Each regiment contained 10 Fähnlein of about 400 men, subdivided into Rotten of 10 ordinary pikemen or 6 Doppelsöldner. The Doppelsöldner, we will talk about this stuff in the former video about Landsknechte war, but in any case, they were paid double for frontline risk, occupied the first two ranks, and carried halberds, Zweiende, normally 1.4 to 1.7 meters long and weighing around 2 kilograms. That required quite some physique, by the way, and in fact, these were picked many in general for many psychophysical reasons. Or arquebuses as well. The standard pike measured approximately 4.2 meters, shorter than the Swiss version, and therefore easier to handle in broken or wooded ground. This is very interesting because considering that the Landsknechte were born in Germany, in a general case, they were employed in Germany and in many different ways. We will in part repeat now. As you understand here, even the shot was not that important in Central Europe. There were yes, there was an important technological advancement, but the availability of certain technologies was not equally sort of directly proportional. And so everything was a bit more fairy tale-like, much more medieval, right? There was an important level of individuality. Many Landsknechte at some point would be hired as veterans by the local noblemen. In certain parts of Germany were still incredibly sort of underdeveloped, very especially in the north. The armies were incredibly backwards. They remained feudal up until the 30 Years' War, right? So the Landsknechte were the guys, were the soldiers, and they had a sense of estate of themselves. They felt themselves elevated by their right to bear arms. In a society like the German one, it was essentially like everybody belonged to somebody else, right? Either the prince or the bishop. It was a very archaic society that, in this sense, is reflected in the Landsknechte as some sort of true, almost, in fact, knightly, if we want to stick to the etymology. There was a knightly estate. In Germany, it was a very different thing. There were noblemen. This is, the same difference that existed between the Sipais and the Janissaries. Like the Sipais, the Janissaries were simply dirty animals, right? Those were instead the higher feudal elite. And so in Germany, it's also pretty much the case. There is a level of traumatic brutality about the Central European social divide. But this is why it was so inspiring, so redeeming for a peasant to simply like elevate himself to that level of soldier. And all those sacks that you see the Landsknechte carried out, for example, the German peasants were fueled probably by some kind of Freudian complex. I mean, they hated so much like the condition they had come from, some serfdom essentially, that they would, as it happened in many other circumstances, once liberated by their profession, take revenge on those lesser, because they felt this need of, they felt ashamed about themselves. They wanted to massacre, to cleanse in blood that kind of memory. Now, the Zweiende was slung across the shoulder rather than seated. Long-standing tradition claimed that mastery, sometimes certified by the Brotherhood of St. Mark as master of the longsword, automatically qualified the bearer for double pay. But surviving primary sources do not confirm a formal institutional tie, indicating that the association is probably a 17th century embellishment. And by the way, in a time which basically Landsknechte did not really count very much, it was a rapid decline of their... They were effectively unions. They had a great negotiable power, as we've seen also with mutinies, etc. And that's where they grew greedy and corrupted, and then the Landsknechte became obsolete in many ways. They were surpassed by other forms of military organization. By the way, at the defense of Vienna, the Landsknechte required to be paid, effectively kidnapping the city and threatening to do to its inhabitants the same things that the Ottomans would have liked to do to them. So that's the level of also sort of overall imperial loyalty that these men really had. Now, the main fighting formation, the Gevierte Ordnung, followed the Swiss pattern but acquired its own characteristics over time. These things should be perhaps studied a little bit better. The same Swiss did not really have that echeloned formation on a regular basis with the three battles, etc. That we know. I mean, the three battles, yes, but let's say that the specific staggering is just witnessed once and then it became iconic of the world. But these armies were quite flexible, even technically that different from the rest. Now, a square 40 to 60 ranks deep placed Doppelsöldner in the leading ranks, ensigns directly behind, bulk of pikemen and halberdiers in the center, seasoned veterans anchoring the rear, and arquebusiers posted along the flanks. Ideally, Forlund Hope advanced ahead to disordered enemy pike walls, while halberdiers rushed any gaps that appeared. Because, by the way, we discussed this in that video criticism of Schola Gladiatori. It's not like the halberd wins over the pike, right? The Swiss literally created their own reformed army in the mid-15th century to fix that, because they had lost against knightly lances that were longer than the halberds. Again, not that per se, but also was a factor. And if anything, you needed these suicidal picked troops that with their Zweiende were actually going to the fray and start chopping pikes to pieces, or at least trying and creating gaps into pike formation could be exploited by somebody else, right? But the halberd per se does not quite compete with a sort of cohesive pike formation. Then in battle everything can happen, but it's not overall in a broader tactical sense, because when you study battles, you know perfectly well it's not this micro tactics, so to say, that we can't even historically document, that really made the thing. It was rather, I don't know, whether a battle line was there or not that makes the difference, right, for whichever reason. It's about collective tactics, and especially this incredibly polluting way to look at these topics through reenactment and HEMA is probably the single most narrow-minded approach to not even the history of the art of war, but even just tactics that you can imagine. But let's skip this up. I'm not specifically referring to Schola Gladiatori, but mostly people that follow those kind of channels. Now, gradually, the Landsknechte shifted away from the headlong Swiss-style battering charge toward circular, so to say, snail maneuvers that permitted multi-directional attacks while maintaining formation and maximizing the effect of supporting firearms. So more complex tactics, telling the truth. Yeah, the big, massive, almost anchored squares in the center of the battlefield, harassed by reiters, that were to gradually decline. Already from the second half of the 16th century, everything was modulated alongside essentially an increasingly linear pattern. Maximilian, back in the day, deliberately fostered the same evolutions back in the day, because again, the idea even of having a static mega square in the center made sense if you had even that many men. But very often the Landsknechte, as we've seen, were, yes, a robust force, but there weren't even that too many, right? And there were many ways the Landsknechte trained in general, like through fencing academies, tournaments, and even court dances that were unsuspectedly actually a very important part of military training. For example, Dutch alternated fire that will develop at the time of Maurice of Nassau between a pike block and another. In the gaps, literally, were just done by imitating, mostly by for tempo reason, this sort of pirouettes that of this local Dutch folk songs. It would literally give the rhythm, and in alternating the musketeers fire. As you understand, it's not even a very effective thing. Things would naturally evolve towards more linear musketry fire, much more, in that sense, less weaselly way. But still, early on, there were so many ways. Again, what is fascinating about this, especially first half of the 16th century soldiers, is, and especially the Landsknechte, is that they consider themselves some sort of privileged order. Right, from the mid-16th century, there was a significant crisis in Europe for multiple generations. Essentially, I made an entire video about this. Soldiers became lesser people, right? Still, at this point, it was an idea stemming from medieval times, also in terms of actual, from actual qualitative participation, because we've seen armies were that big that bearing arms alone was a matter of merit, right? The ragamuffin soldier, in relative terms, is something mostly emerging from later modern warfare, when the fantassin is really just like nobody, right? There is Protestant ideology that destroys further the worthiness of of individuals. There is that fits some sort of broader brutal discipline, regardless of human costs. Only it's entwined from both Protestant and Catholic side, telling the truth. Because also against, we've made many videos about this, that Vulgata that the Dutch and the Swedes essentially unlocked like tactical progress in early modern war. It's actually not true. All right, most of the changes that they were attributed to at times didn't kick into their own national armies up to generations later. And when you look at what the Catholics were doing in parallel, they had by far still the strongest armies. So in a way, like it's all BS. It's more like just like the homogenization of European warfare that changes things at large. But Protestant propaganda was so effective that starting from the late 16th, early 17th century, that eventually especially the Anglo-American world collected it to maintain this idea of dramatic progress. It's not how things really worked. On Schwerpunkt, I didn't make it a point to study early modern warfare in particular that well, but we went on pretty decently looking at all these various aspects, and so it's something you really want to appreciate. There was, again, all even physical training, timing, physical balance, group cohesion, that he made. The Black Band, we mentioned before, was one of the most prominent Landsknecht formations in foreign service for France in the 1510s and 20s. At Pavia, the band formed the foremost French infantry square, but was enveloped by two imperial blocks under Frundsberg and Max Zittich von Ems. After its Obrist Georg Langenmantel was killed, attempting to challenge imperial leaders to single combat, the formation was gripped from both flanks and cut down almost to a man. Right? These were again Germans in French service, and they met their end at the hands of fellow countrymen and colleagues, we can say. After Frundsberg suffered a stroke during the March on Rome in March 1527 and died the following year, the corps slowly lost its earlier cohesion aura of invincibility. Right? That's also, again, the high point. Frundsberg was not a very delicate person. We also talked about how he actually got that stroke, because he argued with Landsknecht for pay. And so, their self-control, but also human limits or something. He brought with himself a golden rope with which he essentially said he would have liked to hang the Pope, just for speaking of Lutheran commanders in the army of the most imperial, Holy Roman Imperial ruler. We have seen, again, like in the video about the Battle of Dreux, the Landsknechte in service in the French Wars of Religion. Also, the initial stages of the 80 Years' War, revealing mounting difficulties with discipline desertion and tactical obsolescence when pitted against the more rigorously controlled and state-maintained Spanish tercios. They were really pioneering pike and shot warfare. Again, the Landsknechte themselves adequated, but they were a bit more primitive, more rustic. After the mid-16th century Germany, the Habsburgs fell back a little bit. Like during the Italian wars, they hadn't sort of been overly shown. Like the same Maximilian's expedition into Italy were a failure fundamentally. So yes, there are these high points of sort of heroism, of military quality of the Landsknecht, the fact that they were terrible, especially because of the sack of Rome, that they, had substantial quality, as seen in Pavia in other instances, that they hated the Swiss. There was this feud. Yeah, it's a bit like the rich tapestry of the Landsknechte legend. For not talking about their clothing, I made an entire video about that. Those were sort of punks of the year. They were counter cultural in a sense. They adopted this adulterated Spanish fashion that they considered at that point that Spanish fashion was naturally rising as the one of the most powerful military out there. But in the Landsknechte version, we talk about military clothing on Schwerpunkt. Again, I made an entire video about that. You find it in the top fixed comment down below. But just for saying how distinguished the Landsknechte really were. Later, when you look at the 30 Years' War, there is already a full homogenization. Essentially, how the tercios fight is basically what the German Habsburgs also go with, right? More or less the same model. At this point, things were not so homogeneous, right? That had been standardized. The doctrinal wisdom was sort of still very uneven, right? So things change according to a pattern. In Dutch rebel armies, German mercenaries were compelled to drop certain characteristic Landsknecht customs, especially those that hindered swift river crossing or shipboard fighting, which was definitely an eventuality during that war, in order to satisfy operational needs. As you understand, there were lots of Landsknechte fighting everywhere, right? At this point, we should enter perhaps in a better video into the specifics of who was actually a Landsknecht. Like, how did you enter the corps? How were you considered as such? What kind of level of what kind of standards were you held up to? But also, in that sense, once you were discharged, disbanded, what kind of connection did you maintain as part of an estate? What kind of relations would you pursue? Like, Germany was pretty big, and this military was, to a degree, relatively uncontrolled. But there was, as we were saying before, a lot of private warfare, right? The same German feudal lords were very much operating on their own. We've seen that in videos about, for example, the war durch Malkaldic. Like, there, Charles V could use, even Neapolitan soldiers, knights in up to Saxony, and northern German armies normally sacked, right? And so there was probably a different level of military capacity across the same pretty big Germany of this time. That was also equally difficult to control by the same imperial military that fundamentally also failed. Again, by the mid-16th century, things start really going worse than before. The high point is Maximilian, Charles V. Now, by the closing decades of the 16th century, the Kaiserliche Fürstknecht, raised directly by the emperor, territorial princes under tighter state oversight and less dependent on free companies, began to replace the classic mercenary regiments as well, which, as we were just saying, brings to that homogenization, but also depersonalization of the Landsknechte. There is a greater control, at least from the local nobility, that also further increases its power as princes in Germany. And so there was a higher connection of the elites, and the same soldiers lost that autonomous way that it seemed, as you've seen also by the time of the German peasant revolt, in a kind of socio-economical sense. Like, the same classes were put down on that occasion by Landsknecht, and was were again the same ones for which they emerged themselves. So it's a phase, it's a sort of broader mechanism again of properly demographic and economic entwinement that follows some sinusoidal trend. And so, as we've seen today, across the century and a half of their existence, the Landsknechte supplied the Holy Roman Emperors with the single most consistent source of large-scale, professionally trained infantry available in Central Europe. They secured decisive field victories at Bicocca, Pavia, and during the 1529 defense of Vienna, they provided the manpower that crushed major domestic rebellions in Germany and Valencia, and they appeared in virtually every significant Habsburg campaign from the late 1480s until the early 17th century. Yet their complete dependence on regular, often interrupted pay, their demonstrated willingness to mutiny when money failed, and their reputation for unrestrained violence, most infamously during the 8-month sack of Rome, also made them an exceptionally volatile and costly tool. Their prolonged dominance therefore reflects both the military creativity of Maximilian I and Charles V in building a dependable Germanic answer to the Swiss model, and the fundamental structural weakness of an empire that could neither assure its soldiers steady wages nor impose full centralized control once the campaign funds were exhausted. All right, so I thought, again, this was a nice addition to our trail, this point of Landsknecht history. The 16th century is underrated to an extent that we will observe better in different ways. All military history is underrated in pop culture, and it's only by taking these steps that we can fully appreciate. We'll have to do something about the Tercio, as a matter of fact, because it's not possible to go with such few content on it. Just for the record, as I was saying, let's say okay. 3. This is the 4th video. Yeah, we made also a video about the Swiss and the Landsknecht and so on. What about their dress, etc. So, yeah, we're getting there gradually. 3 videos on the Tercios as well. So yeah, for that matter, it's very satisfying to have come this far, and we're going to. Where did I don't even remember. Wait a second. Yeah, because some of this is just an introduction, by the way. There is from our lottery early sort of Renaissance warfare, let's put it in this way, series. There are so many different branches we will analyze at this point. The same, I don't know, German cavalry of the era, for example, or other aspects. We talk about artillery. And we also have to see these guys in action. We have to talk more about sieges, about battles. We can't really go without all this stuff. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.